I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by award-winning science fiction author and space scientist, Dr. David Brin. In addition to writing dozens of best-selling novels and short stories, some of which have been adapted for film and television, David is a 2010 Fellow of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, helped establish the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, serves on the advisory board of NASA's Innovative and Advanced Concepts Group, and does futurism consulting for diverse organizations, including the U.S. Department of Defense, Procter Gamble, SAP, Google, and many more. David is the winner of numerous awards and honors, including the prestigious Nebula, Hugo, and Locus Awards for Science Fiction, and holds a PhD in space science from the University of California. So, David, welcome back. You are becoming a regular, and I cannot thank you enough. It is always a pleasure and an honor to have you with me.
You're a fun interviewer, Tim, and you have a very lively and curious audience.
Oh, well, thank you. Today, we're discussing themes from your novel Existence, which begins when orbital garbage collector Gerald Livingstone finds a mysterious crystal that ends up being an alien artifact containing the message, "Join us." So what can you share with us about this without giving away any spoilers? Because I don't want to ruin it for potential readers here.
So in Existence, the centerpiece is the question of the Fermi Paradox. I'm sure that your listeners are by now very familiar with it. Back in 1983, I had a paper in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society that coined the term the Great Silence. And there are people out there who think that it's a better term for the situation that we face. I mean, the Fermi Paradox was coined a few years later, and Fermi had almost nothing to do with it. The Great Silence is, we've been listening for signs of radio traffic amid the stars, which would indicate vast civilizations. We've been looking in the optical and other things, and so far have seen no signs. And certain types of scenarios for the universe are already totally excluded. I mean, we've sampled enough galaxies to know that none of them have been disassembled into infrared emitting, masses of computronium. So some of the more garish or extreme sci-fi scenarios have already been refuted. And that includes some scenarios having to do with interstellar travel. And I imagine we're going to talk about that. If I were to, mind you, back in that 1983 paper, I was the first person to catalog a list of different proposed solutions for the Great Silence. And so I cataloged some as under the zoo hypothesis, for example. There are about a dozen of those. For various and sundry reasons and with various and sundry skills, aliens have kept us in the dark, hidden their presence from us. And there are various versions of that, ranging from the Star Trek Prime Directive to keeping us in quarantine and ignorance because, for example, we're great creators of art in our ignorance. And if we found out about galactic civilization, we'd become copycats and no longer spew out all this fantastic stuff, including reality shows. And if we are a reality show, then the aliens probably imposed a recent president on us because it probably increased their ratings by making us look even crazier. But in any event, the one form of contact with extraterrestrial life that I think there's a real chance that you and I might live to see happen is if we keep NASA and NASA's budget up and send enough probes out into the asteroid belt, we might find remnants of earlier interstellar probes. Sometimes they're called von Neumann machines because John von Neumann did some papers about how a machine could make copies of itself. so the premise for von Neumann replicators is that an alien race could send just one to a nearby star system. It would mine asteroidal resources, make a dozen copies of itself, fuel them from local resources, and launch them onto a dozen more stars, while it does its job of hanging around and keeping an eye on that solar system. In 1985, I participated in the first Interstellar Migration Conference at Los Alamos. And there were calculations made about how long it would take such a single self-replicating probe to fill the galaxy with its descendants, assuming that it can't travel any faster than 10% of the speed of light. And it turned out that the galaxy could be filled with such things within 3 million years.
Yeah.
Now that feels like a long time to an individual, one long time for a man, but not very long for humankind. And so our descendants, if we include as descendants these self-replicating robots, they could meet each other at the other end of the galaxy, however mutated those descendants have become. It turns out that if we were to have starships that could go 10% of the speed of light and carry humans, if only, sperm and ova that robots could then plant on planets, which is one of the many scenarios for self-replicating probes, one of the missions they might be given. If we did that and the colonies had to take the time to build up their populations and their technologies again to the level where they had, interplanetary travel and the ability to make more starships. Now that's a fairly long time. That's a lot longer than a self-replicating probe. I mean, you're going to need a couple centuries to do that. And yet, all that means is that the filling the galaxy time is only 20 times bigger, 60 million years.
Well, and David, if I could jump in for just a moment, I have been on a von Neumann probe kick lately, and I'm sure people who watch a lot of my interviews will probably echo that. They're like, "Tim, knock it off. You're doing too much." But the thing that excites me about it is exactly what you said. It's this ability to self-replicate and the doubling capacity, right? It's this exponential growth of probes. So if you could contrast that, I guess, let me back up just a second. I think most people grew up in the age of Star Trek and Star Wars, right? And so we have kind of that Starfleet, get in a ship, explore the galaxy model in our heads. The problem being that's really just a plot-driven, character-driven series, right? Star Trek is essentially a Western. Star Wars is essentially a fantasy, and most of your space movies are simply 3-act plays that try and get space travel out of the way for character development and plot transformation. But in terms of this Starfleet model, if you built somehow thousands of starships with tens of thousands of people on them and set out to explore the galaxy, you still wouldn't make a dent in it, and it would take lifetimes to do, right? Whereas what you're describing in terms of self-replicating probes, that is something where it could potentially take millions of years to do, but it doesn't take anywhere near the kind of labor or, population to get started with it, right? So it seems like it's a lot more logical.
Well, there are ways in which self-replicating von Neumann probes are much more logical in many ways, but to back up a little bit, I don't know that I'd call Star Trek a Western. There was a TV series called Firefly and its movie Serenity that did the whole Western thing just absolutely brilliantly. I would call Star Trek well, it's a love ode to the great American project of diversity. I mean, it's not just that you have 3-act plays, it's that you have a perpetual expansion of the concept of an inclusive community. And that's the basic idea behind the Federation. And it has problems. But the ship archetype in Star Trek is a naval vessel like the HMS Beagle that took Darwin around the world, and that he based his theory of evolution on what he learned. In other words, a naval vessel during an era when, you know, the captain is also a minister, plenipotentiary, an ambassador, able to make treaties. It all sounds very familiar with Star Trek because it's a little bit wild and woolly, and they have to deal with problems on the scene. And with that big vessel, you don't have the thing that I detest most about Star Wars, and it's there in most fantasies, but it's particularly detestable in Star Wars, and that is the whole focus on Ubermensch, on demigods. And I won't go into my Yoda, you know, George Lucas rant. It's all in my latest book, a nonfiction book, Vivid Tomorrows, Science Fiction and Hollywood, where I talk about how science fiction cinema probably saved humanity. I mean, the Oppenheimer movie's out right now, and Barbie, both of them telling cautionary tales about where we might go if we're not careful. But the notion that science fiction cinema helped to prevent World War III. Well, we have Dr. Strangelove, On the Beach, Failsafe, War Games, Testament, The Day After, all of which had some effects we now know. The warnings about Chernobyl-type events from the China Syndrome. Soylent Green recruited tens of millions of environmentalists and may deserve some credit if we manage to squeak by this crisis. And the granddaddy of self-preventing prophecies, George Orwell's 1984. So the point is that Star Trek has a naval vessel, and so Star Trek is skeptical of demigods. Whenever they meet a demigod, they're skeptical because the captain is merely way, way, way above average, a person, a human. Whereas, and needs help from other way above average crewmates in every episode. And the Federation as a topic, how will we deal with the diversity that we find out there? That is the constant topic for the American experiment that we're wrestling with right now in our daily lives. It's a fascinating topic. And so I consider Star Trek to be a thought experiment luau, where we, well, what if this? What if this? What if this? What if this? Whereas Star Wars, the ship is a World War I fighter. And you have your demigod pilot Ace with his silk scarf, and there's only room aboard that for his gunner, or Achilles and Patroclus, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, the knight and squire. It's the old notion that is rife in fantasy of demigods. And in Star Wars, it's demigods all the way down. Regular people, including the regular species who have to watch the galaxy ripped to shreds by one mutant family from Naboo. It's a horrible tragedy, and I wouldn't blame all the other races in the galaxy for hunting down every human. Having done that, having said that, Riff, let me get back to von Neumann machines, because of course, it seems highly unlikely that there's any such thing as warp drive. If there were, then as depicted in Star Trek, within a few hundred years, all the quadrants of the galaxy would be in touch with each other. And prime directive or no, we would be seeing them. So I am skeptical about about hyperdrive. And that doesn't mean that I won't include it in my novels. It's a great way to have your heroine kiss her husband and pat the kids on the head and go off and have adventures and come back in time for dinner. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
You can't beat it as a plot device. Now, to get to your question, there are problems with the von Neumann machine as well.
Mm.
And that is, you launch this thing, it's programmed to do what you wanted it to do, but one, it might mutate. Over many generations exposed to cosmic rays, it might mutate or start doing what it wants to do instead of what you were told to do. Or what it was told to do becomes programming that becomes regrettable. Go thou forth to that solar system and make a whole lot of paper clips.
Yeah.
And it makes copies and sends them on, and they turn the whole galaxy into paper clips. Or they come back and they're sent out to do bad things to enemies, and they come back and don't recognize their makers anymore. So mutation is one of the problems with von Neumann machines. But then they start meeting each other, maybe. And if they meet each other, they're likely to have different programming, different missions. And so part of my novel existence is to explore that possibility, a possibility that, as I said earlier, you and I, or some of the younger folks listening in right now, may actually live to see, because it's the form of alien contact that I consider to be most plausible, which is that we'll go into the asteroid belt and find either dead remnants or possibly still alive remnants of these self-replicating probes that have been watching us or that failed a long time ago. And so existence posits that this happened, and then it stopped happening about 60 million years ago. And this form of life, these self-replicating probes that had conflict, that fought each other, that allied with each other for various reasons in the asteroid belt, are no longer relevant by the time Gerald Livingstone pulls in that crystal. So I hope I addressed, the whole notion. And yes, I do believe that is the most likely form of contact.
Wonderful. Well, and, I mean, just to kind of continue and dig into this a little bit more, in existence, you had mentioned there are a dozen different ways that self-replicating probes might have happened already. And some of that could parallel bacteria or viruses, right? So, it doesn't necessarily just have to be, and I have a couple examples that I'll come to in a minute, but it doesn't just have to be what people would conceive of as your stereotypical alien device, right?
Well, the reason why I believe that it seems likely that aliens would send out these probes is, A, they're fantastically efficient once you are wealthy enough to send a few.
Yeah.
Because then they use local resources wherever they go, and they make copies of themselves, and you had to do it once. It's a very difficult problem to solve, making the first one right. Moreover, it's expensive. And people say, well, why wouldn't you just use radio waves? Radio waves are a lot cheaper than, as in the movie Contact, are a lot cheaper than building a probe. Well, yeah, they're a lot cheaper for the first few years, maybe for the first century. But eventually there comes a point in time where send your bottle into the sea and forget about it is a lot less expensive than maintaining major transmitters that are shouting yoo-hoo into the cosmos.
Well, and if I can interject, I did an interview with Robert Zubrin last week, and he had talked about bandwidth related to transmitting power. And one of the things that he had pointed out was, if we're shouting yoo-hoo into the cosmos, the amount of power required to do that with a reasonable bandwidth rate is going to be prohibitive. And that's not something that any alien species would want to keep up. So, one of the explanations for, or sorry, one of the solutions for the Fermi paradox was potentially ET goes to something else, right? Tight beam laser, or God knows, quantum communications, or
Well, let's bear in mind
intergalactic
that
can string.
radio can be tight beam like a laser. It's called a maser. And there are several on this planet that are capable of sending beam messages that would be very bright at neighboring star systems. And I'm part of the SETI community. A fairly large fraction of the SETI researchers resigned in protest. It might even be 20 years ago, when a bunch of cultish fanatics pretty much took over all the SETI commissions and started making excuses for what's called METI, message to ETI, and that's shouting yoo-hoo. And what's very clear is that the cliche from the movie Contact that is very, very popular is aliens already know about us because of I Love Lucy, because of leakage from the Earth. And it doesn't matter how many times we show on paper that that's just not true. I mean, it's a cliche that people cling to. Like those 3 letters you told me we shouldn't raise, starting with you. The point is that even when Earth was at its maximum noisiest in radio in the 1980s, and it's a lot quieter now because we've moved a lot of our communications to tight beams and to fiber optics. And we no longer have these giant blaring radar systems that we had in the Cold War. Even the new ones that keep watch are much more efficient. Even back in the 1980s, that leakage calculates out to fade away into static, unless you have an antenna the size of Connecticut aimed at us, in which case you might pick out some of our TV. And so the SETI guys, the METI guys say, well, why not these guys are more advanced than us. We may make Connecticut-sized antennas less than 100 years from now. Fine. Aliens might be advanced. They might make Connecticut-sized radio receivers. Problem is, in that case, is that they can only focus on the most tiniest portion of the sky. And they have to dwell for at least a month to integrate to be sure that they are picking up intelligent signals. Which means that either you have to make a lot of them, and I mean a really, really lot of them, to keep checking everywhere on the sky, or you do it sensible and you turn it, check out this solar system that we know has maybe planets that have life on it, because that's going to be fairly easy to detect. We'll be able to detect an Earth-like planet that its biosignatures out to 100 light years within a decade from now, maybe 2 decades. So they're going to catalog everywhere that has life within a few hundred light years. But how are they going to deal with the fact that, gosh, 1,000 years ago we checked and this Earth place didn't have any radio. 1,000 years ago this place didn't. Well, they're going to take that Connecticut-sized receiver, they're going to aim it at Earth, listen for and then listen for a while, and then listen for a while, move on to the next one. And maybe the last time they checked Earth was 1870.
Yeah.
Just before Marconi.
Couldn't that explain SETI's? I mean, I know SETI gets candidate signals occasionally, but couldn't that explain the very challenges that they face as well, right? It's simply an enormous galaxy. I mean, 400 billion stars, I think, at the maximum.
Yeah, but we need to bear in mind that SETI was based upon the premise, first was based on the premise that you see in the movie Contact, and that is beacons. Well, we're pretty darn sure there aren't any beacons. We weren't so sure 30 years ago that there weren't tutorial beacons beamed out by friendly, super godlike aliens to help folks like us. Too bad in a sense, but we've checked that box. My friend Liu Cixin, who wrote The Three-Body Problem, and I have a picture of him standing in front of that painting. He's become this international celebrity because, and 2 movie versions of The Three-Body Problem are being made. Wonderful book. But it takes the paranoid opposite extreme, and that is, you got to be quiet, hunker down, because it's a dark forest out there, and everybody's killing everybody else just for their own safety's sake. I doubt that too.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a more plausible scenario than the absurd justifications being given by these SETI guys. And I know some of them. Some of them are very nice fellows. And the justification they give is that the older aliens are cowards. They're waiting for us to speak first. They're waiting for the junior most and most naive and least advanced race to shout first. So it's a complicated situation, and I have to say, look, I have been involved in studying the alien for about 55 years. It's 60 years since the first time I heard all these familiar chants about how the government is going to finally reveal the truth. 60 years hearing the same darn stuff over and over and over and over again. I've studied the alien in SETI, in astrophysics. I've done thought experiments about the alien in a huge range of science fiction. I think I know a thing or two about the range of possibilities that we're able to think. Now, I grant you, I mean, there's stuff I can't imagine. And it just depresses me that so many folks get their notions from the cheapest and worst cinematic sci-fi, rather than actually looking at the range of really, really interesting possibilities that have some consistency with what we observe in the world.
Well, and David, that is one of the reasons that I again, it is such an honor to be able to interview you. And I love doing interviews like this because one of the things that I'm finding is a new generation of people are coming up who haven't read classic sci-fi, right? And that's one of those, through no fault of their own, it's just so much easier to turn on the TV. And these days, your millennial generation isn't even watching as much TV. So if it isn't on TikTok, they haven't seen it. And so they're not familiar with these ideas. And,
I have to respond to that with a song from Bye Bye Birdie, which I recommend to you, young whippersnappers. Kids, what's the matter with kids today? Why can't they be like we were, perfect in every way? What's the matter with kids today?
Yeah, I know. I
I
sound
know.
like a curmudgeon. I sound like a
We're
curmudgeon.
curmudgeons, you and I. Now, nevertheless, guys out there, guys and gals, Tim and I do have a point. The depth of ideas that you're going to get from the high end science fiction thought experiments in writing, in books, are just a lot more complex and nuanced. They go into they are the driver, the economic driver is to create a richly complex future of possibilities. And the economic driver in cinema, and mind you, I love many, many science fiction flicks. And my book, Vivid Tomorrows, is all about how sci-fi cinema probably saved all of our lives. Nevertheless, having said that, everything tends to be extremely simplistic.
Yeah.
The universe tends not to be.
Well, and the other phrase that comes to my mind is "there's nothing new under the sun." And when you look at classic science fiction, like one of my personal favorites is Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? And so the Sentinel that Clarke originally loosely based 2001 on, you had a space probe that was on the moon waiting, and I think that's a brilliant idea. I would love to see NASA at least talk more about looking for those there.
Well, we have, and by the way, it was Stanley Kubrick, who made 2001 based upon Clarke's story, The Sentinel, though Clarke got involved in the making of the movie considerably in more depth than I was allowed to be involved in the movie of my novel, The Postman by Kevin Costner. One of the great fails in the history of movie scheduling, he brought out his movie, which, by the way, I think is visually and musically quite gorgeous and has a big heart. He brought it out the same weekend as Titanic. People don't tend to remember that. In any event, yeah, I'm involved with NASA in a lot of ways, and NASA has done very, very careful mapping of the moon, including gravitational and magnetic anomalies, which the anomalies are, magnetic anomaly is what leads the astronauts in 2001 to find TMA-1, the monolith that was buried and sends out a screech of radio when the sunlight hits it for the first time in 3 million years. We're pretty darn sure there's no such thing there on the lunar surface. But as it happens, there are these pseudo-moons that we've only recently discovered. There's half a dozen of them. They're no larger than a kilometer, generally smaller than that. And they have unstable, over the course of many millions of years, orbits around the sun that happen to bring them close to the Earth, extremely close to the Earth. And so they would be very cool observation platforms over a relatively short period of 1 million years or 2 million years. And the Chinese have even expressed an interest in using their Maser radio telescope to scan these guys and see if there are metallic reflections, anything that looks like it might be a smooth machine surface, or simply to ping them. Because one of the possibilities, I had several stories. I ask, why wouldn't they answer? Because we've said who within the solar system. So if they have a probe inside the solar system and their job is to wait until we say hello, As a matter of fact, 20 years ago, an anthropologist checked off one of the boxes that I thought was absolutely adorable. It was really, really cool. And he said, well, what if there's an alien probe in the solar system and it's already sampling our internet? It's already tuning in. Maybe it is waiting for an invitation. So he created a website. It might still be up there. Last I checked, maybe 2-3 years ago, called Invitation to ETI. IETI, I believe it is. And it basically makes the statement, hello, if you're trolling the internet, if you're trolling through the internet, this page is directed directly at you. Hello, could you please say hello back? And I contributed a subsidiary page that's there on the IETI site, if it's still up, that went through 13 possible reasons why they haven't said hello yet. And said, well, if you're not saying hello because you've watched our movies and you're scared of us, please bear in mind that these movies were designed in order to try to scare us into being better. We're actually better than we're portrayed in our movies. If you're not talking to us because you're stealing our culture, if you're not talking to us, so I go through these things. Years later, I took that list of 13 possibilities and stuck them into a later chapter of my novel Existence. Because when you get right down to it, if there are living von Neumann probes, not on these little moonlets I was talking about, but farther out in the asteroid belt, which I think is the most likely place because they could then conceal themselves amid all the rocks. If that's the case, then they are clearly not saying hello. And my friend, his website has not been answered.
On that note, let me thank you so much for your time today. These are enormous topics. I actually scratched down probably, I don't know, 5 pages worth of notes on this. But again, it is far too much to go through. It'd be an endurance challenge. Let me thank you so much for the time that you've shared with me. I will put links in to the novel Existence, as well as your website and your other works. So thank you again.
All right, close. And just as a note, you'll also link to, I hope, my reply about the U initials.
Yes, and I will try and find. I found The Great Silence. I actually did find The Great Silence. I'll try and put a link into that, as well as current event stuff. And there's. This is a very interesting time, but from my perspective, my hope is to be able to just share ideas and information about space science. And again, as we mentioned earlier, ideas from this wealth of 20th, early 21st century fiction that a new generation of people just aren't familiar with.
And how in the world can we not compare ourselves? Sure, we compare ourselves to what we ought to be. We chide ourselves that we're not what we ought to be, without noticing that the mythology that we should be better than we are was not held by any previous culture. It's our own divine madness that we can achieve Star Trek and much better civilization that makes us angry that we've been lied to by our parents. Well, guess what? That lie has helped to motivate your listeners to try to make a better world. So go ahead, fight, make a better world, criticize, but always compare us also to the previous 6,000 years of darkness. We are accomplishing, and my biggest explanation for the Fermi Paradox is that we may be the first to overcome. I think we're on the verge of overcoming our natures and becoming truly respect-worthy. In which case, if we're the first in this galaxy, that gives our descendants a mission to cross the galaxy rescuing everybody else. Wow, that's a lot at stake. Anyway, all right. Well, thank you for your thank you, Tim.
Thank you again for your time, sir.